I went to visit my daughter unannounced and saw my future son-in-law's car parked at her gate. But what stunned me was hearing him say from inside, "We need to get all the money before she changes her mind." I froze. My heart sank. Everything I believed in was quietly slipping away. What was I supposed to do, knowing my own daughter was involved? And this was just the beginning. I pulled the cornbread out of the oven just before noon. Still warm, wrapped in a clean dish towel, it sat in the passenger seat next to me as I drove toward Sydney's house. I didn't call ahead. I rarely did. After all these years, I learned not to expect much more than a polite nod and a quick coffee, but I still showed up because I'm her mother. And sometimes you bring what you can. A soft voice, a steady hand, or a pan of cornbread made with too much care for someone who barely notices. It was a quiet drive through the edges of Wichita, the kind where traffic is slow and your thoughts get loud. I passed the same wheat field, the same rusted mailbox that always leans a little too far right. Life hadn't changed much on my end. Retired now, I spent most days tending the backyard, sorting recipes, watching the wind bend the tall grass. I had saved steadily. Years of nursing work, odd jobs, coupon cutting and no-frills living had left me with just over 300,000 in savings. I never thought it was something others needed to know. When Sydney moved out at 19, we stayed in touch, but only in that structured, polite way grown children sometimes keep in place. Birthdays, holidays, a few phone calls in between. Her life had become a space I was invited to enter only on occasion, and I accepted that. I didn't want to smother her. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who loomed. I just wanted to be close enough to matter. That day, I wore my good cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons, not because it was special, but because it made me feel presentable. I parked across the street. Her front garden looked neat, but the hedges hadn't been trimmed in a while. That small detail made my chest tighten. She used to care about things like that. I grabbed the cornbread and walked toward the front gate, and that's when I saw it. Ethan's truck, parked close, too close. My hand stopped just short of the gate latch. I stood still. The windows were cracked open and I heard voices. His voice low but clear. And then I heard something else. A sentence that landed like cold steel. "We have to move the money before she changes her mind." My hand tightened around the dish towel. For a second I thought I misheard. But then came Sydney's voice. She laughed. Soft. Sharp. A sound I used to know as joy now rang hollow. I didn't move. My heart didn't race, it froze. It was as if time pulled back and waited for me to understand something I wasn't ready to hear. Have you ever brought a gift to someone, only to find out you were the one being taken from? If you've been there. If you've felt that quiet shift where love becomes a question mark. You'll understand what came next. Because that day, with nothing but a cornbread in hand, I turned away, and something inside me turned with it. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at the kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of tea staring at the cornbread I never gave her. It stayed on the counter, still wrapped, untouched. The house was quiet in that way only a house for one can be. Not peaceful, just still. At sunrise, I trimmed my roses, fed the birds. I tried to stay busy, to stay numb, but something in me had shifted. By early afternoon, I got in the car again. Same road, same hedges. But this time I parked further down and walked. I didn't bring the cornbread. I didn't bring anything. The truck was there again. Same spot. My steps slowed as I approached. I stopped by the mailbox, eyes on the side of the house where the kitchen window was cracked open. Then I heard him again. "Ethan, you need to make sure she never finds out about the savings. If she even thinks you're planning something, it all goes to hell." His voice was sharper than the day before, like he was done pretending. Sydney replied a little too calm. I know. She still believes we care about her the way we used to. Just a sweet old lady who brings baked goods and wants to talk about the past. They both laughed. The kind of laugh people use when they know they've gotten away with something. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. It was something more silent than that, like watching a curtain drop after the play ends. And all you can do is sit there in the dark, wondering how long you were fooled. I turned and walked back. The gravel cracked under my shoes. My hands stayed loose at my sides. I didn't cry. Not even when I pulled into my own driveway and looked around at the yard I had cared for so many years. Inside, I sat down at the edge of the bed. My palms felt raw. That day I didn't do chores. I didn't make tea. I didn't reach for the phone. I just sat and listened to the quiet. Sydney's voice echoed, that soft cruelty in her tone, like I had become a background character in her story, the old woman with savings she could mold like clay. I remembered a time she used to leave notes in my lunchbox when I worked double shifts, crayon hearts, little I love yous with smiley faces. Those faded scraps of paper were still in the bottom drawer of my desk. I hadn't looked at them in years. But that night I did. I opened the drawer, pulled out the stack of old cards, birthday drawings, the ones she made when she was 8, 10, 12. I held them in my lap and realized something bitter. The girl who made these was gone. Maybe she'd been gone for a long time. Maybe I just never wanted to believe it. My hands shook, but not from age, not from cold, from truth. Whatever I thought we had left between us, it wasn't trust. It was habit. And habit won't protect you when someone decides you're a resource, not a person. And that night, I decided I would never walk up to that door again without knowing exactly what I was walking into. The next day, I went back. It wasn't part of any plan. I didn't have some brilliant idea yet. I just knew I needed to be sure that what I had heard wasn't a passing misunderstanding or some twisted coincidence. This time I left earlier, just after lunch. I drove slower, parked a few blocks away, walked in the shade of the trees like I had done 100 times before. When I reached the house, I didn't go near the window. I stayed by the fence this time, just close enough to hear. Their voices were inside, clearer than ever. Ethan said, "She thinks the savings are still under her name, but we already moved what we needed." Sydney replied, "She'll never notice. She still prints things and keeps them in a drawer. The woman barely checks her online accounts." Then Ethan said, "Just make sure she doesn't start asking questions. If she gets suspicious, everything goes sideways." Sydney let out a little laugh and said, "She still thinks we love her like before. It's actually kind of sweet in a pathetic way. That one hurt." I turned around, didn't wait to hear the rest. The walk back felt longer. I didn't cry. I didn't rush. But something inside me curled in on itself, like an old leaf folding at the edges. At home, I went straight to the kitchen. The cornbread I had baked 3 days ago was still there, still wrapped, still untouched. I took it in my hands. Then I unwrapped it, tore it apart, and dropped it piece by piece into the compost bin. No sound, just the slow rhythm of release. Afterward, I sat on the porch with the breeze brushing my arms and realized something. This wasn't the kind of betrayal that comes with screaming or slamming doors. It was quieter, colder, calculated. They hadn't robbed me with force, they were bleeding me out with smiles. I kept thinking about that word Sydney used. Pathetic. She didn't say it with hate. She said it like it was a fact, like it was reasonable to see me that way. That night I couldn't sleep again, so I went to the cabinet and pulled out my documents. Savings account statements, copies of my will, the folder marked for emergencies. I sat with everything on the dining table, sorted, read, reread. Then I opened a smaller box, a black tin where I had kept old letters and cards. At the bottom was a letter I had written but never sent. It was addressed to Sydney. I had written it 5 years ago after she cancelled a visit last minute and forgot my birthday the same week. In that letter I had written about missing her, about hoping we could get close again, about all the things I still wanted to share. Reading it now felt like listening to someone else's hope. I folded the letter back slowly, and I knew then I had spent so long trying to stay close to the idea of her, I hadn't noticed the real person she had become. Someone I didn't know anymore. Someone who looked at me and saw an account, a name on a document, a resource to be managed. So I stopped writing letters that night and started thinking about what comes next. Not to hurt her, but to finally protect myself. That morning, I woke up before the sun had even touched the horizon. It was quiet, but not the kind that soothed me like it once did. It was the kind of quiet that stretched too far too long and wrapped around my chest like a cord pulling tight. The kind of silence that didn't ask for peace but warned of change. The house creaked the same way it always had. The wind moved the curtains like fingers brushing skin. But I wasn't the same. Something inside me had shifted a slow tilt, like the earth deciding it was tired of spinning in place. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the wind skim over the lawn. My hands didn't shake, but there was a tension under the skin in the bones, as if I had been bracing for something for far too long. The porch light was still on. I hadn't remembered leaving it that way. All morning I moved through the house as if I was in someone else's body. The dishes were clean, the floor was swept, the garden watered. Everything was in order, and yet none of it felt right. The normalcy had grown sharp edges. I sat in my old armchair by the kitchen and stared at the stack of mail I hadn't touched. One envelope caught my eye, not because it was special, but because it was plain. Sydney had once sent me letters in envelopes like that, back when she was in college, before the texts and the transactions. I didn't open it. I just let my eyes rest on it. Then I noticed something strange. The compost bin outside was fuller than I remembered. I stepped outside and lifted the lid. There it was, the rest of the cornbread, the one I'd torn in half and dropped before leaving Sydney's. She must have found it in my car. She must have known. That made my stomach turn. I walked back inside more slowly now. I sat again, hands on my lap. I needed to understand if I had imagined everything, if maybe Ethan had pushed her, or if Sydney had only played along. But the sound of her voice, the calm certainty in it when she said I still thought they loved me, it echoed with too much clarity. And then I remembered. A few months ago, Sydney had asked a question that didn't make sense at the time. Something like, "Do you still keep the savings at the credit union, or did you move them?" I had laughed it off, told her I didn't remember. I thought it was just casual conversation. But now I could see it wasn't. The seed had been planted long before the cornbread, long before Ethan. Maybe he was the one speaking, but Sydney had her own ways of asking for what she wanted without ever saying it directly. And I had taught her that. Taught her how to survive quietly. I just never thought she'd use it on me. The silence around me thickened. Not a peaceful silence, but one that carried too much weight. Every tick of the clock reminded me that I had choices to make, and that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't ready to sit still and be the woman they thought would always be too kind to notice. The world outside continued its slow spin. Birds landed near the window, then flew off. I stayed seated, eyes open, breath even. But deep inside, something in me had woken up. Not in rage, not even in sorrow, just in knowing. And sometimes knowing is what begins everything. I sat at the edge of my bed, palms resting on my thighs, staring at the old dresser across the room. The sun was starting to set, casting long golden lines across the floorboards. I hadn't turned on the light. Somehow the dimness felt more honest. My hands, once strong enough to haul bags of fertilizer and fix fences by myself, were now marked by years of work and quiet sacrifice. The thick calluses along my fingers were fading, but the memory of why they formed hadn't. I remembered the late shifts, cleaning office buildings, followed by early mornings, stacking boxes at the back of the local pharmacy. Also, Sydney could have clean uniforms, lunch money, and a chance at college. I raised her alone after Harold died. She was 9. I still remember the way she curled into my side that first night without him. I told her I'd protect her, and I did. Every scraped knee, every science fair, every heartbreak. She didn't want to talk about, I was there, even when she didn't see it. That first apartment near Douglas Street was a box with peeling wallpaper and pipes that groaned all night. But it had a window that looked out onto a red maple, and Sydney used to sit on the windowsill, legs crossed, sketching birds with crayons. I kept one of those sketches. It's in a folder behind the tax documents. There were years I thought we had made it through the worst. She graduated from university. I helped pay the tuition. Quietly. I just wanted her to stand on her own. And she did. For a while. I pulled the top drawer open slow and steady, like uncovering something sacred. There, tucked under some winter scarves, was my savings logbook. I opened it with care, flipping through the pages covered in my tight handwriting. Every deposit over the years, from every shift and every overtime, noted with dates and side comments. $317,000. That number had never felt impressive to anyone else. But to me it was a lifetime. It was birthday cakes I baked instead of buying. It was clothes mended instead of replaced. It was vacation days I never took, so I could keep the health insurance. Beside the logbook was a manila folder. Inside it, the original draft of my will. Simple. Sydney would inherit everything. I had written it 10 years ago without a second thought. There was also a letter never sealed, never sent. I had written it the night she turned 25. It was full of hope and a kind of aching love. I told her how proud I was, how I knew she'd make mistakes, but I trusted her heart. I had never shown it to her. Now I held it and wondered if I had been wrong. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. The air felt still, as if the house was waiting to see what I would do next. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I thought I would. But no tears came. Just a quiet understanding that love, the kind I had poured into every piece of this life, could be used by others in ways I never imagined. That night, I placed the letter back in the folder. Then I left the logbook out on the table. Tomorrow I would make calls. But tonight, I let the weight of it all settle into my bones. Not with despair, but with clarity. I wasn't the same mother who wrote that letter, and Sydney wasn't the same daughter who used to draw birds in the window. That truth, as painful as it was, felt like the beginning of something else, something I would face with open eyes. The next morning, I stepped into the small branch of Midland Bank downtown. The fluorescent lights buzzed low above me as a young woman behind the counter greeted me with a tired smile. Her name tag said Emilia. She couldn't have been older than Sydney when she first got her driver's license. I asked for a private consultation, and soon I was led into a glass-walled office where a gentleman in his 40s, neat hair, soft voice, sat across from me. He listened carefully as I explained that I wanted to revise some arrangements concerning my savings. I kept my tone even, never mentioning my daughter or Ethan. I told him I'd like to set up a revocable trust with some stipulations in place, and that I would be seeking help from a non-profit to serve as the eventual trustee. He didn't ask for explanations. He just nodded, typing gently on his keyboard. When he printed the preliminary forms for me to review, he pointed out that there would be a waiting period and some verification steps. That suited me just fine. On my way out, I stopped by the library. It had been a while. I went straight to the community bulletin board and studied the flyers tacked along the edges. There it was, bright blue print against white paper shelter and signal. A support network for older women facing emotional and financial abuse, including from family members. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday, 2 towns over. I took down the number. Back home, I didn't turn on the TV, I didn't play music. I just opened the windows and let the breeze carry in the faint sound of birds and faraway planes. In the corner of the hall closet, wrapped in a dust cloth, was the old camcorder. I hadn't touched it in years. It was a gift from Harold before he passed. We had filmed birthdays, holiday mornings, that road trip to Santa Fe when Sydney was 12. I set it on the kitchen counter and plugged it in, waiting for the battery light to blink green. That afternoon, I sat down at the table, pressed record, and looked straight into the lens. My voice didn't shake. I didn't start with anger. I started with memory. The sound of Sydney's laugh when she was 7. Her arms flung around my neck after her graduation. The smell of her baby shampoo. I wanted it all to be in there. But I didn't stop at the sweet parts. I spoke about the days I worked double shifts. I spoke about the decisions I made alone. And then I spoke about what had changed, what I had overheard, what I had felt when I realized that my trust had become a strategy in someone else's playbook. I ended the recording by saying this wasn't a plea for forgiveness nor a final goodbye. It was simply a record, something to outlive words left unsaid. That night I made a second call. Inez Delgado. Her name had been listed as the regional coordinator for Shelter and Signal. Her voice was steady, warm, but professional. She listened more than she spoke. I told her I wasn't ready for group meetings, but I wanted to know more about the trustee program they offered. She didn't rush me. She simply said, "We'll move at your pace." And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't walking through fog anymore. By the time I went to bed, the camera had been safely packed away, and the bank paperwork was folded neatly in a folder by the door. It wasn't just a change in paperwork. It was the start of something new, quiet, steady, mine. Sydney called on a Thursday morning. Her voice was light, almost chirpy. She said Ethan had been experimenting with duck à l'orange and wanted to know if I'd like to come over for dinner on Sunday. It was the first invitation I'd received in weeks. I paused just long enough for her to notice, then agreed. I told her I'd bring a salad. Sunday evening, I stood outside their front door holding a bowl of spinach pear and candied pecans. The porch light flickered above me. For a moment I thought about turning around, but I knocked. Sydney opened the door in her soft pink sweater, her makeup fresh, the scent of citrus glaze floating out from the kitchen. Inside, Ethan greeted me like nothing had happened. His grin stretched too wide. He poured wine. He complimented the salad. The table was set with gold-trimmed plates I didn't recognize. They were performing. Dinner was quiet at first, polite. Sydney talked about her yoga class. Ethan said something about market volatility. I nodded, chewed slowly. My eyes stayed on the china. It had little violets around the rim. Ethan cleared his throat halfway through dessert. "We've been thinking," he began, slicing his tiramisu with the side of his spoon, "about the future. About transparency, really. Just making sure everything's aligned now. You know, with the way things are headed." Sydney looked down at her plate. Her spoon trembled slightly in her hand, but she didn't speak. I wiped my mouth, set my napkin aside. "That's wise," I said. "In fact, I've been doing some organizing myself, cleaning up old papers, updating a few things." Ethan's smile faltered just a second. Then he recovered. Great minds think alike. I leaned back. Now everything's clear. No more loose ends. Sydney didn't meet my gaze. She excused herself to check the kettle. Ethan stayed at the table, drumming his fingers against the stem of his glass. No one asked specifics. That was the point. They assumed I'd taken their hints, and I let them believe it. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even guess, was that the arrangements had already been made, and none of it pointed in their direction. After dessert, I offered to help with the dishes. Sydney said no, she had it. I stood for a moment at the kitchen threshold, watching her rinse the plates with her back turned. I told her the salad bowl could stay. She barely nodded. Outside, the night had cooled. The stars were faint but present. I walked slowly back to the car, every step deliberate. Not because I was tired, but because this was the beginning of the end. I didn't cry. Not that night, not in the days that followed. I had done what I needed. There was no undoing it now. Later that week, I met with Inez Delgado in person for the first time. She wore a slate blue scarf and brought along the official documents to finalize the trustee transfer. Everything was calm, clinical, yet there was a quiet kind of power in her presence. She didn't ask about Sydney. I didn't offer details. By the time I returned home, the house smelled like thyme and apples from the candle I'd lit earlier. I sat down in the living room, turned on the camcorder one more time. This time I spoke not to the past, but to the echo of a future I wouldn't see. A version of my daughter who might one day want to understand. There are some truths too heavy for the moment they happen. But with time, maybe they settle into something gentler, something close to clarity. The morning I signed the papers, the sky was still heavy with late winter clouds. It had rained overnight. The driveway glistened, and the bird bath out back held a perfect circle of water. Inez Delgado arrived just before 10. She came alone, carrying a folder tucked beneath her arm, and a quiet sort of grace that always reminded me of old courtrooms and polished oak chairs. She took off her gloves gently and placed them beside her tea without a word. We reviewed the documents one last time. I had gone over every clause in the trust, how the funds would be directed to shelter and signal, how Sydney would be eligible for her share, only if she maintained consistent non-financial contact for 3 uninterrupted years. No financial requests, no indirect probing through Ethan, just presence. Just being a daughter. That was all I asked. The rest would be managed under Inez's watch. Her name now stood beside mine as co-trustee until I was gone, and when that day came, she would be the one to ensure the money served its intended purpose, protecting women who had been quietly manipulated or erased by those closest to them. I signed on the line. Inez did too. The notary we had scheduled online confirmed everything in a video session, and just like that, the shift was sealed. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like drawing a boundary in sand and watching the tide roll in. After she left, I placed the folder in the fireproof box under my bed, the same place I used to keep Sydney's birth certificate, her school drawings, the first letter she wrote from college. Some of those are still there. I couldn't bring myself to remove them. That evening I walked through the garden and pulled weeds around the rosemary. The sky opened up for a short while and the light turned gold. I stood quietly among the growing things and let myself feel the edge of grief that comes not from loss, but from choosing to hold your own shape when someone you love keeps pressing you to fold. Inside, I opened the drawer in the kitchen and took out my recipe book. The page with the cornmeal loaf was still marked with an old grocery receipt. I ran my fingers over the scribbled notes from years ago. Sydney likes extra honey and bake until just golden. I rewrote the recipe on clean paper. Then I wrote one sentence at the bottom in pencil. It read, "This is what love tastes like." I folded the paper and placed it behind the camcorder's memory card. I didn't know if anyone would find it, but I wanted it to be somewhere. The next day, I boxed up a few things: old linens, winter coats for donation. As I sorted through the cedar chest, I came across a bundle of letters tied with string, mostly my own handwriting notes. I had never sent, thoughts I had never dared share. I kept only one. The rest I burned in the fireplace, watching the pages curl inward like closing hands. In that moment, I didn't feel anger, just space, an unexpected quiet where noise used to be. By nightfall, I lit the lamp beside my reading chair, took a deep breath, and sat down with no intention but stillness. The camcorder remained off. The documents were locked. The decisions were made. There was nothing left to untangle. Only the slow, strange peace of a woman who no longer had anything to prove. I mailed the letter on a Thursday. Just a single sheet of paper handwritten in my usual blue ink. The envelope had no return address. Only their names written in the same hand that once signed every permission slip, every check, every birthday card. Dinner this Sunday, same time as always. That was all I wrote. I wasn't sure they would come. But I had set the table anyway, polished the old silver, pulled the pale yellow tablecloth from the cedar chest, and laid it across the table like a memory. The house smelled of rosemary and sweet corn. I had baked the same cornmeal loaf I used to bring when Sydney was little. Back then, she'd tear off the crust and save the softest middle for last. I never asked why. It just made her happy, and that was enough. At 6 sharp, I heard their car pull in, the engine cut off, then footsteps on the gravel. Sydney walked in first. She wore a pale sweater, her hair pulled back like she used to in high school. Ethan followed, always a half step behind her. They both carried the performance of casual politeness, but the air between us was tight and rehearsed. "Smells good," Ethan said, forcing a smile. "You always did make the best cornbread." I just nodded and gestured toward the table. The meal passed with small talk and sips of wine. I let them speak. Ethan asked vague questions about how I'd been. Sydney complimented the table setting, but their eyes kept scanning the room like they were waiting for something. After we finished the stew, I brought out the loaf. I placed it on the table uncut. The golden crust shimmered faintly under the lamp. "I thought it might be time to bring this back," I said quietly. Sydney froze for a moment. Then she reached for the knife, but stopped halfway. Ethan chuckled. "That loaf's probably worth its weight in gold by now." I met his gaze without flinching. "Some things are, especially when you've spent years earning the right to make them." He smiled, but his eyes sharpened. "Speaking of value, I assume everything's in order. The will, the accounts, no surprises." That was when I placed the small camcorder on the table. "Not turned on, just present. I've recorded everything I needed to," I said. They didn't speak. "Inez has the rest, and if anything's unclear, she'll handle it." Sydney sat back slowly. Her mouth opened slightly but said nothing. I reached for the knife and sliced the loaf myself. The sound of the crust breaking was the only noise in the room. I placed a slice on each plate. "This is the last time we speak of money over a meal," I said. "If either of you want more than that, speak with her." No one reached for their slice. The silence stretched, long and brittle. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain. Ethan cleared his throat. "Of course. We understand." I stood and began clearing plates, not because the dinner was over, but because I had already said what I came to say. They left soon after. Sydney kissed my cheek, stiff and brief. Ethan offered to help with dishes, but I declined. When the door closed behind them, I sat back at the table. The loaf remained untouched. I didn't mind. That night, I wrapped what was left in foil and slid it into the fridge. There was always tomorrow. And maybe one day someone would come to the table for more than just inheritance. Maybe someone would come for the bread. It was nearly a week later when the call came. A number I didn't recognize lit up on the screen. I let it ring once, twice. Something inside told me to answer. A quiet voice. Older, cautious. Her name was Marlene. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, "but I believe you know Ethan. I used to be close with his mother, before she passed." I sat down at the edge of my bed, heart sinking. "I watched what happened to her," she continued. "Bit by bit, she disappeared. Gave him everything. Her savings, her house. By the time she got sick, he barely visited." Her breath caught. I found a journal in her things. She had written about Sydney, about how they were planning something. That was 2 years ago. I think he's doing it again. My chest tightened. There was a strange calm that followed, the kind that only comes when something terrible finally makes sense. She told me Ethan had been in and out of women's lives for years, not romantically, but financially. He targeted women who had something inheritance land pensions, built trust, used their children as bridges, then convinced them to sign things they didn't fully understand. And when he was done, he vanished. Marlene's voice softened. "I just thought, maybe, if someone had warned me, her story might have ended differently." We spoke for nearly an hour. I told her about the camcorder, about the trust, about Inez. When I hung up, the house felt heavy, but not with fear, with confirmation. Ethan was never just careless. He was calculated, and Sydney, for all her silence, had let it happen. I stood by the window and watched the bare trees sway. It had been a mild winter, but the wind that day carried a cold that reached deeper. I realized something then. My decisions weren't only about protecting my savings, they were about breaking a pattern, stopping something from crawling into the next generation. That night, I went into the closet and pulled out a thick binder. I opened to the section Inez had marked with a green tab. Legacy Provisions. I scribbled an extra note. If Sydney ever needed help beyond money, help for healing, help for truth, then let the trust support that. But not before. Not unless she asked with her own voice. Without Ethan. This wasn't revenge. This was a line in the sand. Quiet. Firm. The next morning I walked into town and stopped by the library, left a small donation in my husband's name. Then I visited the community shelter, spoke to the coordinator about expanding their elder support program. I offered the use of my backyard for gardening workshops. He looked at me like I was doing something noble, but really I was just taking back space that almost became someone else's game board. That afternoon I stood in the kitchen making tea when I caught my reflection in the window. I looked tired, but not fragile. Ethan had a pattern, but now I had mine. No more quiet consent. No more silent hands signing over pieces of a life I had worked too long to build. Whatever came next, Sydney's silence, Ethan's charm, or the wind itself, I had already chosen my part. And I would not be moved. That morning the light came in soft through the kitchen window. I was folding dish towels, the ones with faded floral prints, when my fingers paused. I opened the drawer under the stove, reached to the very back, and pulled out the old camcorder. It had been weeks since I last touched it. I carried it into the living room and placed it on the coffee table, sat down across from it. Just looked at it for a long while. It wasn't for show. It wasn't for proof. It was for memory, for voice. I reached over and pressed record. My voice was quiet at first, but steady. I spoke to the future, not to a courtroom, not to Sydney, not to Ethan, to whoever would find this years from now, when the dust had settled and the letters had turned yellow. Maybe a granddaughter. Maybe Sydney herself, long after the illusions had peeled away. I told the story from the beginning, not just of what happened this year, but of who I had been. How I scraped money together while raising Sydney. How I patched clothes. How I cried silently in the bathroom after double shifts at the hospital cafeteria. I talked about her birth. How I had folded tiny blankets with trembling hands. How I had sung to her every night. How the sound of her laughter once made me feel like the world would never hurt me again. Then I paused. I told the truth of now. I said I had heard her voice through the door that day, that it wasn't just the words that cut, but the ease with which they were said, the ease that only comes when the heart has long closed its doors. But even now, I told the camcorder I didn't hate her. I hated the silence between us. I hated how I let it grow, how I mistook absence for peace, and how I let her think my love came with no boundaries. I ended the recording with a soft smile. Not a happy one, a knowing one. One that said, "This is mine, this story, this strength, this sorrow." I took the camcorder and walked down the hall to the linen closet, tucked it behind the towels next to a lavender sachet and an old scarf she had once given me. Not hidden, not obvious, just waiting. Back in the living room, I sat in my armchair. The house was quiet, not heavy, not broken, just still. Outside, a wind picked up. The branches tapped against the glass. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had done something right. Not loud, not dramatic, just right. It wasn't for justice. It wasn't for apology. It was so that if the day ever came when Sydney wondered what had gone wrong, she wouldn't have to guess. She could press play and know. It was late autumn when I saw her silhouette outside my window. The wind had turned sharp, and the sky held that pale grey only November knew. I opened the door before she knocked. There she stood. Sydney. In both hands she held a warm, foil-wrapped loaf. I could tell by the scent rising in the cold air. Cornbread, just like the ones I used to bring over all those years. Her coat was too thin for the weather, her lips pressed together not in a smile, not in apology. Her eyes were red, but no tears came. Just that searching look, the kind people wear when they are not sure if they will be welcomed or sent away. She didn't speak. I didn't either. I stepped back just enough to hold the door open. The heat from inside brushed her face. She didn't move right away, just stood there like she needed to feel that warmth for 1 second more before crossing the threshold. When she did step in, her shoes barely made a sound. She placed the bread on the table without a word. Her hands lingered on the edges of the foil, smoothing it gently. Then she looked at me. No explanations, no justifications. No, "I'm sorry," but somehow it didn't feel empty. I poured tea. She sat. Across from each other in the same chairs where so many silences had stretched too far. This time the silence felt different. Not forced, not angry, just present. I didn't ask why she came. I didn't need to. Sometimes the most powerful words are the ones unsaid, and the deepest forgiveness is the kind you don't announce. She didn't stay long, but when she stood, she placed her hand lightly on mine, just once, and left. I closed the door behind her, left the bread on the table. Later that evening, I cut a piece, warmed it, and took a bite. It was dry around the edges, uneven in the center, but it was warm, it was real, and it was enough. If you've ever stood at a doorway, unsure if you'd be welcomed or turned away, then maybe you understand what this moment truly meant. This story may not end with grand forgiveness, but with something quieter. A door left open, a loaf of bread, a memory shared in silence.